All right, good evening to 4 of you so far. Welcome to this Show Me Murder live stream. I'm going to give just a couple more minutes here before I start reading the script, just to see if we get any late arrivals showing up. But thank you all for joining me. I've got the chat screen open here if you have any questions as we're going through tonight, or if you just want to say hi and stick around at the end. I will do some Q&A at the end as well. Had a lot of good results with these in the past. The last live stream that I got is sitting at 186 views. That was for the Meeks murders that I did about a month and a half, 2 months ago. And the first live stream that I did was for the Randolph Tavern fire, which many of you have heard is the first episode of season 1. I see a couple of other viewers popping in and out. Like I say, if you want to drop me a message on the live chat screen, I will get to those questions as I can. Of course, my chat screen is over here and my script is over here. So if you have any questions during the live reading, I'll try to get to those as I can. And we're going to go ahead and get started. It was still dark outside the modest, white, one-story house in Archie, Missouri. Beyond its windows' green shutters, one could see only the first hints of sunlight glowing at the horizon. It was dark inside, too, except for the dim light from a lone oil lamp. Its glow extended only a short way into the room, illuminating the pages of a Bible. The silence was broken only momentarily as the man flipped the page. He had been reading for a couple of hours now, not really paying attention to the passage of time. He had a train to catch soon, and had stayed awake reading the good book while he waited. Before this, he had calmly heated some water on the stove to wash up, put on a fresh set of clothes, and then did some writing. He sat near the bed, and on the nightstand next to it were the 2 letters he'd prepared. In them, he expressed how he felt he had been given an unfair lot in life since his brief stint in the state penitentiary, how he felt he couldn't properly provide for his family, and how tomorrow he was going to meet with the one responsible. He also explained how his affairs could be put in order using money owed him from those who hadn't closed their accounts at his butcher's shop before he sold it. Pleased with his writing, the letters were folded neatly and left where they could be found. After he wrote them, he had walked into the next room and tucked in his daughter with her favorite doll, and then sat down to read. Now, distantly, he heard the low rumble of the train. It was almost time. Edward Bates Soper closed the Bible, laid it down, and stood. He let out a deep sigh and stretched, his muscles tight after sitting for too long. It had been a few hours since they had really done anything, though it had been familiar work for them and none too tiring. He gathered a few things, some money, his hat, his house key, and then took one last look around. In the bed, his wife and 2-year-old son lay peacefully, as they had been the whole time he had been reading, just feet away. Her head was nearly unrecognizable after sustaining several blows from the axe that was now leaning in the doorway. The boy's head was split in 2. In another room, his 6-year-old daughter had suffered the same fate. Edward blew out the lamp, put on his hat, and left through the front door, ready to catch his train. The lock clicked, and he disappeared, and inside, all was silent again. This is Show Me Murder. Well, again, welcome to those of you who've joined me so far. I hope to see some more joining the live stream. This is a live reading of one of the episodes of Season 1 of Show Me Murder, my podcast, which you can find on Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Google Play, and TuneIn. So far, I'm working on a couple others. But I'm excited to say, and I want to say a thank you to those of you who are watching and those of you who have listened. Just in the last couple of days, I broke 1,000 downloads. I'll be honest, I don't know whether that's good or bad for a new podcast with only 7 episodes, but I launched at the beginning of September, so I feel pretty good about those numbers in that amount of time. And that's not counting another 300 some odd views on YouTube that we're adding to that count tonight. And I hope that you will share this video, share this show with your friends, and get people to keep listening. And as I've said before, a shameless plug, but I love doing this. But if it's a lot of work, if you want me to keep doing it, I just need more people to listen. At some point, I hope to be able to monetize this thing, but in order to do that, I need a certain amount of numbers. So I expect to do at least season 2, maybe season 3. And frankly, if I'm not making any money at that point, I'll reevaluate then. I may keep doing it just because I'm having a blast doing it. But do please share the show and get other people to listen, especially if you know they like true crime. One of the beauties of doing a podcast that is dedicated to crimes in Missouri is I'm going to be able to bring you cases and bring true crimes fans cases that I doubt they've heard anywhere else. And I bet for a lot of people, this is one of them, this case that I'm reading tonight. But as I said, this case is a lot of work. If you want to get an example of where some of this information comes from, I just got a new stack of documents today from the Missouri State Archives for a case that I'm working on now for season 2. This is all for one case. So I'm excited to bring you that, but it is a lot of work. And I can't wait to bring you that case. It started off very simple, but it's turned into one that's very complicated with a lot of levels. One other thing I want to ask you before I get back into the script here, I'm going to start soliciting reviews of the podcast. So if you find us on mainly our Facebook page, and I've got a website in the works at some point, but we've also got, of course, an Instagram page and Twitter, but really on Facebook, if you have watched the show, listened to the show, and have enjoyed it, and maybe if you haven't, I'm looking for some reviews so I can help use those to promote the show. So if you would please leave me a review sometime when you feel like it. The other thing that I'll mention before I get into the script is you'll hear towards the end here, I'll plug this again, but one of the things that Edward Bates Soper did after his killing spree, if you will, he left letters behind, as I just referenced in that teaser there, in that intro. He left letters behind. And throughout this case, you'll hear a lot of speculation. You may wonder yourself what his mental status was. And a lot of people at the time certainly did. Well, this case having happened so long ago, more than a century ago, it didn't seem likely we could get an answer to that question. But I was able to take the letters that Soper left behind and share them with a forensic psychiatrist, a forensic psychologist who works with the Missouri Department of Health, Dr. Angeline Stanislaus. And I was very pleased with the department and Dr. Stanislaus being willing to participate in my show. She read the letters of Edward Bates Soper. She read this script, and then she sat down with me for what ended up being like an hour-long interview to pick apart what we could make of this guy's psyche. And she has interviewed people on death row in Illinois and Missouri and actually found him comparable to some of the people she'd interviewed. I encourage you to find the podcast and listen to that interview. I found it fascinating. It was a great conversation for me to be able to have that conversation with her. I was just so glad that she was willing to participate. Also, the tours at Missouri State Penitentiary have just wrapped up for the season. We'll start up again in March. But if you're a fan of the show, wherever in the world you are, if you're looking for something to do sometime, if you're a history nut or really just find this show fascinating, come take one of my tours after we start again in March. Me or any of the other guides, you'll enjoy all of us. But I would love to meet you in person. Come and say hi and take one of my tours at Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City, Missouri. A few thank yous for this episode. Some of the people that helped me get the information that went into the script I'm going to be reading tonight. Daryl Limpus, who's a resident over in Archie, Missouri, where the murders that began this case took place. Deb Bova also helped me with quite a bit of the research. She had dug into this case herself and was willing to share what she had found with me, and I'm very appreciative of that. There was a certain unnamed staffer at the city of Archie who helped point me in the right direction to find some of what I needed. I already mentioned Dr. Stanislaus, as well as the director of the Department of Mental Health, Mark Stringer, and Dr. Stanislaus's assistant, Ronette Schulte, and I appreciate them helping me get that interview set up and agreeing to participate. And Professor Rodney Uphoff at the University of Missouri School of Law helped me with some of the digging as well. So just a few people I want to thank. And again, please find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Please leave some feedback. I would love to hear from you. And please share this show with your friends. Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Google Play, Google Podcasts so far where you can find Show Me Murder. And again, I'm working on season 2. I cannot wait to share it with you. So let's get back into tonight's script on Edward Bates Soper. John Soper was a peaceful man, the 6th of 13 children and the first born to one of the first white settlers in what today is Cass County, Missouri. John was reportedly quite a partier in his youth, with some writings suggesting that he may have enjoyed drinking more than most. By adulthood, he was said to have reformed and become, quote, one of the most steady, quiet, and exemplary citizens of the community. He was a man of marked intelligence and great energy and was rapidly coming to the front as one of the representative men of the county, end quote. By the late 1870s, John and his wife Sarah had 6 children, some of them coming into adulthood. He owned a farm about 4 miles south of Kearney in Missouri and was said to have been peaceable, industrious, and mild-mannered, never speaking ill of anyone, and thought to have no enemies. Local residents expressed shock then when it became apparent John had at least one enemy. On January 30th, 1880, while he was out feeding his livestock some 75 yards from the house, those in the house heard 2 quick gunshots. His children ran outside and called to him, "Father, Father, come quick, there's a man getting hurt." They heard no response, but saw a man with a pistol pointed at the ground. He fired 2 more shots and then ran, jumping a fence and disappearing over a hill. When the family ran to the scene, one by one they cried out in anguish at seeing it was John who had been shot. He lay on the ground, speechless and motionless, his head and face covered in blood. Reports say John was carried into the house, where he died a few minutes later. He had been shot 4 times in the head, any one of those a fatal wound. Searchers were dispatched in all directions, but the killer was not caught. Local officials gathered and prepared a petition to Governor John Phelps, asking for the highest possible reward to be offered to solve the murder of a man they called harmless, innocent, and unoffending. $1,200 was raised locally to go along with any sum the state could put forth. Several people were arrested for the crime, including a clock repairer and some of the Soper's neighbors. They were all eventually released, save one. Thomas Mabe, one of the neighbors, was indicted by a grand jury, but after spending about a year in jail, was never tried. Some called for the reward money that had been raised to be given to him and his family for their suffering during those months. There was some suspicion early on that one of John's own sons, Edward, had committed the murder, but he was shown to have an alibi. Years passed. The case became local lore recorded in history books, and it seemed that John Soper's killer would never be found, nor would justice come in his family's tragedy. The Soper family tried to move on. John's oldest son, Samuel, studied at what today is Truman State University in Kirksville and became, quote, one of Missouri's most distinguished educators. Another son, Archibald, became a druggist in Kansas City. It wasn't long after John was murdered that another in the family popped up in local gossip. In 1881, Edward Bates Soper, who had been at least briefly suspected in his father's murder, was sent to Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City for grand larceny. He had stolen a horse and was sentenced to 2 years. Life at MSP was difficult for convicts who in the 1800s were used as labor, either in building and maintaining the prison structures or for private business owners who contracted with the state and often built factories within the walls. In addition to poor food, worse sanitation, and what at times was brutal manual labor, corporal punishment was used for those who misbehaved, including water torture and floggings with a cat of 9 tails. Soper seemingly behaved himself and was released in September of 1882 under a state law allowing prisoners to get out of MSP having served only 3/4 of a sentence. The following year, he married Adelia Hunt. The couple had 3 children, though one, Samuel, died a month after his birth in 1884. Maud was born around a year later, and Gillis was born in 1888. The family lived on Soper's mother's farm for 6 years. By 1887, when his brother Samuel died of what was thought to be malaria, Edward was running a drugstore in Kearney. The family moved to Arkansas for a few years. Then in 1890, the family moved to Archie at the southern edge of Clay County. The little town of about 270, which, like so many others, was founded to be a stop on the railroad, had by 1890 several shops, several doctors, at least one hotel, a bank, and, of course, the railroad depot. When Edward came to town, he began work as a butcher. Soper and his family were welcomed in the small community. He came from a family that was well known in that part of the state, and the family made many friends. He was generally considered polite, but people noticed that he often wouldn't look another person in the eye. Others noted that he had a habit of saying, yes, sir, at the end of statements, and calling everyone brother. Some claimed he never laughed and avoided conversation. It was reported that Soper did good business in Archie, but by early the following year, it became common knowledge that he and the family were going to move out of town. Soper arranged to sell his butcher shop, rent out his home, and began collecting on accounts that weren't paid up. On Tuesday, April 20th, 1891, Soper went to the town of Adrian, about 12 miles south, and returned in the late afternoon. People who spoke to him said he expressed plans to go into the dairy business near there or Garden City. Early the next morning, he bought a train ticket and left for Kansas City. For the rest of that day, the people of Archie went about their business. The day was all but unexceptional, but some neighbors noticed that it was quiet around the Soper home. The two young children were not seen outside, laughing and playing as usual. Adelia wasn't hanging out the wash to dry or tending to the flowers and shrubs around the home. There was no hint of any activity at all. Thursday came and went much the same. Neighbors tried knocking at the door, but there was no response. Some of the other local children probably also tried to call on their playmates, but with no answer at the door, they went back to their own games. Finally, on Friday, concern had grown to the point that the locals decided someone should check on the Soper family. Milton Hodges, a local justice of the peace, was called upon. He went to the home that evening, and after more attempts to call on someone went unanswered, he ordered that the door be forced open. Hodges had to have suspected something was wrong, but one wonders if he had any idea what he would see. It easily could have caused him nightmares for the rest of his days. Once the door was opened, Hodges listened for any sound, but inside it was utterly still. He stepped in and saw nothing unusual in the parlor, but then he glanced into a sleeping room. There, laying on a couch, 6-year-old Ma lay unmoving. He stepped closer and saw that her head had been split open. The blood on the couch had long since dried, telling them that she had been there for some time. Her killer had rolled her onto her back, straightened her legs, and put her hands on her chest. A doll had been laid at her side. Hodges tore his eyes from the scene, and after collecting himself, went to search the rest of the home. In the next room, he found Adelia and Gillis. The 2-year-old was laying next to his mother on the bed. Both of them were dead. Both had been killed in the same way as young Maud. Adelia was unrecognizable. Both had clearly been struck repeatedly. Blood and gore were splattered on the walls and the ceiling. Leaning on the bedroom doorframe was the apparent murder weapon, an axe, still covered in evidence of the crime. Above the bed hung a sign that read, "What is home without a mother?" On a nightstand next to the bed where the mother and the young boy lay, Hodges found 2 letters. One was addressed to him. It was dated April 21st, 1891, the preceding Tuesday. It read, M.W. Hodges, you will find enclosed with this letter for the Kansas City, a letter for the Kansas City Times. Please send it to them as I wish to have it published. My family relations have always been of the most pleasant kind. Give my wife and babies a decent burial, and sell what I have to pay the expenses. P.S. You will find the key to this house above the door outside. Also, collect what is due me from the parties here. You will find it all in my book here. The letter to the Times began with a question. Is life worth living? 8 years ago, I was released from the penitentiary. Since then, my life has been a failure. For 4 years, I have tried to live in my native country, but continually met with reminders of my disgrace, sometimes one way and then another. I went to Arkansas, hoping to feel better, but the trouble of my disgrace followed me and has been a burden all the time. No matter how one tries to live after being in the pen, if he has a sensible nature, there is always something to remind him of his disgrace and make his life miserable. But I might have borne this if it had not been for another trouble. Since I came to Archie, I have attended church some and have been studying my spiritual welfare. There is a time, we know not when, a place we know not where, that marks the destiny of man to glory or despair. In other words, man reaches a point beyond which there is no redemption. He cannot repent if he would. This is my condition. Tell me then, is life worth living? It was only a question of time when I should leave my family forever and ever. I do not care to live any longer, and rather than leave them in this sinful world, I'd rather take their lives. I believe I am merciful, for I don't want them to suffer as I have. I'm going from here to Clay County to kill a devil that has been mainly the cause of all my trouble. Then I shall end my miserable existence. Before this reaches you, my spirit shall be wandering beyond the shores of time, across the dark Jordan of death. Now with a bruised and bleeding heart I bid farewell to all that is near and dear. My friends, weep not for me. Endeavor to live so that you may escape the punishment that has been my lot. Farewell. Both letters were signed Edward Bates Soper. The sheriff telegraphed Kansas City authorities with a description of the crime and of Soper, but he was not found there. Authorities in Clay County also looked for him based on what he said in that second letter, but he wasn't spotted there either. In the days following the crime, authorities picked up leads that Soper was seen in various places in eastern Kansas. According to one report, he stole a wagon and team of horses from a brick company and abandoned them west of Kansas City, Kansas. Another said that he had breakfast in Leavenworth on the day the bodies of his family were discovered. Many suspected that Soper would go after his uncle, T.T. Soper, and one Professor T.H. Crafton at Missouri City. Both were said to have had a hand in sending him to the penitentiary. A couple of papers learned about Soper's brother Archibald, who was a druggist in Kansas City. Archibald learned of the murders through a local policeman who was a friend of the family. At first, he didn't believe the story, but when he was convinced it was true, he, quote, wept like a child. Archibald said his brother had written him a letter 2 weeks prior complaining that his business was bad, the price of beef was high, and that he was struggling to support his family. Quote, I thought at the time his mind must be affected, for as I had learned before, he had a prosperous business. He added, I must believe from what you tell me that he committed the deed while insane, for always he had the warmest affection for his wife. Archibald said he hadn't seen his brother for months, but if he were to come to the door, he would fear him, quote, as he would a wild beast, and would at once notify the police. An article in the Kansas City Star said that the bodies of Adelia, Maud, and Gillis were so badly decomposed and bloated that they were placed in a box and burned in a cemetery near Archie. But by most accounts, the three were buried together in a common grave east of town. The bloody sheets that were the only thing covering them. Today, it is believed they were buried somewhere in what was Hall Bernard Cemetery. Now, on a sad note, a few weeks ago, I went to visit their graves. It appears, unfortunately, that all the markers were bulldozed down, and at least part of the cemetery might now be under a lagoon. The markers may have been pushed into a drainage ditch off the South Grand River. It's really a shame, honestly. Now, some sources also say that when the bodies were removed, an additional horror was discovered, that Adelia had been pregnant at the time she was killed. Investigators first looked at the possibility that she and the children were killed Wednesday morning before Soper boarded the train, but after talking to witnesses, it seemed more likely it happened sometime Tuesday. Adelia and the children had been seen before noon that day, but not since. Though authorities searched for Soper in earnest, the trail went cold almost immediately. On June 18, 1891, nearly 2 months after the murders, a body closely resembling his description was pulled from the Missouri River in Kansas City near the mouth of the Blue River. A few days later, it was decided it was not that of Soper. With no attempts made on the life of Soper's uncle or Professor Crafton, and no additional sightings, it seemed the murders, like that of Soper's father 11 years prior, would go unpunished. In May of 1894, a man was arrested in California on the belief that he was Soper. This caused some initial excitement when word spread that the murderer had been found, but it was soon proven to be a false identification. The case again went cold. 3 more years passed. The murders of Adelia and her children, and whatever became of Edward Bates Soper, seemed to be passing into legend. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, in June of 1897, newspapers declared that Soper had been caught. Those who remembered the same headlines running 3 years prior were likely skeptical and expected to learn that it was another case of mistaken identity. This time, the killer had supposedly been found in Oregon. He had been living under an assumed name, had remarried, and had left her, taking their 2-year-old child, who he reportedly killed. Only this time, the story didn't go away. Soper had actually been found. He was captured by Kansas City police officer Sam Lowe, the brother of then Jackson County prosecutor Frank Lowe. Officer Lowe himself went to Oregon, made the arrest, and brought Soper back to Missouri to stand trial. According to newspaper accounts, it was Frank Lowe who, quite by accident, discovered where Soper was. While glancing over newspapers in a YMCA reading room in April, Lowe picked up a Portland newspaper and saw an article about a woman looking for her husband and 2-year-old child. The woman, alternately described as having been a widow or having divorced another man to marry Soper, said her husband had never said an unkind word to her and had typically passed all his free time at home. But one afternoon, he took the child and said he was going to see a shoemaker. He took $250 with him. She said it was normal for him to keep such an amount of money with him, and he never returned. She hadn't seen him or their child since. The article referred to her as Mrs. Soper. Frank Lowe immediately remembered the Soper murders in Archie. He contacted his younger brother, who then was a rookie police officer, and they made plans for Sam to go to Oregon and make the arrest. Quote, "We have been keeping this thing dead quiet for fear our plans would become known. Not even the police authorities knew where Sam was going, and I was in a fever of unease until I received a telegram after midnight last night saying that Soper had been arrested and had made a confession," Frank Lowe told the Kansas City Journal. He said he wanted to see his brother get the $700 reward for Soper's capture and prove his worth was greater than the assignments he had been given as a rookie police officer. Quote, "I was specially anxious to help the boy, to show that he was fitted for better work than spotting policemen," Frank told the paper. The younger Lowe told a paper he had been looking into Soper's case for years and had been on his trail for a year and a half. He said at one point he had traveled to Oregon and returned with the wrong man. According to the Lowes, Sam did not sleep well for 3 nights before setting off for Portland, taking with him requisition papers signed by Governor Lon Vest Stevens for Soper's arrest. When he arrived, he learned that Soper had been working for the Pullman Rail Car Company as a cleaner of their sleeper cars under the name Sandy Preston. He learned that after leaving Portland, Soper had gone to Oregon City and eventually to Ashland, Oregon, where he had taken the name Homer Lee. Soper was apparently interested in buying or had leased a fruit farm and was in the process of working in irrigation ditches. Sam posed as a tramp and got a job with the same team. Once he was sure he had his man, he got a buggy and returned to the worksite where he confronted Soper with a revolver. "God, to think I should be arrested after so many years," Soper said when Lowe confronted him. He made no effort to deny his identity or to resist arrest. Lowe quickly and quietly smuggled Soper through Portland to avoid local authorities making any claims to him for the murder of his child there. The two even hid in a boxcar overnight until the train that would take them to Omaha set out. Lowe talked to Soper about the whereabouts of the 2-year-old son he'd taken with him when he had left his wife in Albina, today a part of Portland. She had said that Soper sent her a letter saying the child, named Gillis — this was the same name as the son he had murdered in Archie — had been left where it would be cared for. But he told Lowe he had thrown the boy into the Willamette River to drown. Lowe said that during their journey east, Soper would wake from his sleep shouting, quote, he can't swim, poor little fellow." Aside from that, Soper reportedly expressed no remorse, except for having told his wife in Oregon his real name, which led to his discovery and arrest. Soper's wife, Katharina Henriette Brownlew Prince, who he had left with little or no money, had been working as a domestic servant to raise money for a reward for finding her son. When confronted with the report he'd been killed, she initially didn't believe it. Quote, "He has always been such a kind husband and so good to the children. I am ill from grief alone, and if I don't get the child back, I shall die," she told an Oregon paper. Her aunt came to care for her and described her as nearly dead from grief. Soper told the Lowes upon arriving in Missouri that he would write his wife about their child, and he did. Quote, "My dearest Katie, I write you once more to ask you, forgive if possible. No one can realize what I have suffered unless you do," he wrote. He told her that he had buried their son and where to find him. Quote, "It was the same old melancholy feeling that comes over me that caused this. And you know that you were talking of taking poison," he added, as if to somehow spread the guilt beyond himself. He offered to send her what money he had if she would take it. Quote, "Please tell me where to send the money, and then I hope to feel some better. Your loving but unworthy husband. P.S. Don't hate me, for I can't help it." Now, you might notice, as with his earlier letters, Soper shows here no remorse for his crimes and tries to paint himself as a victim, perhaps suffering from some mental issue that has led him to kill. After receiving Soper's letter, his wife went to authorities in Oregon, who searched the area where he said he'd buried the boy, but he was not found. They suspected the story was a lie and that the child had indeed been drowned in the Willamette. One man, however, would not quit looking. Identified only as Dr. Kessler, he wrote again to Soper, seeking a better description of where little Gillis had been buried. Soper's reply was apparently no more clear than his first description, but Kessler continued his search. In July 1897, nearly a month after Soper was taken from Portland, Kessler located a mound near the mouth of a gulch, and beneath it was the body of an infant. It was identified by its clothing and cap as being Gillis. An investigation revealed further horror. The doctor said it appeared Soper had attempted to strangle the child, but only rendered him unconscious. Believing the boy dead, he then buried him alive. The child had awakened in his shallow grave and struggled to free himself before suffocating. His mother, who still had clung to the belief that he was alive, was further crushed by this news. Gillis was said to have been buried in the Lone Fir Pioneer Cemetery in Portland. Soper was secured in the Cass County Jail, where hundreds reportedly came to see him and confirmed it was him. Now we take a quick break in the script for a moment to look at some of the other events happening in the world around the same time as these events were playing out. So on April 1st of 1891, the Wrigley Company was founded in Chicago, Illinois. The following year, it began packaging with its canned baking powder chewing gum, which eventually became more popular than the baking powder and became the company's focal product. April 25th of 1891, the same year the murders happened in Archie, Nikola Tesla patents an electrical resonant transformer circuit, better known as the Tesla coil. On June 25th of that year, the Strand magazine in London publishes a series of short stories featuring Detective Sherlock Holmes. This is recognized as the beginning of the character's popularity. On October 31st, the relatively new football teams from the University of Kansas and the University of Missouri met in Kansas City in the first meeting of what would be known as the Border War, referring to the hostilities between the two states during the U.S. Civil War and before the U.S. Civil War. By the way, Kansas won that first matchup 22-10. Late in 1891, Canadian-American physical educator, physician, and chaplain James Naismith responded to an unruly class made short-tempered by being confined indoors due to cold weather by mounting 2 peach baskets to railings inside a gymnasium and teaching students a game involving getting a soccer ball into the baskets. This was the invention of what we today know as the game of basketball. Now, continuing with the story of Edward Bates Soper, he remained in jail until his trial, which began with the jury selection November 30th, 1897. The following day, the town of Harrisonville was filled with spectators hoping to catch a glimpse of the man and follow his trial. It appears Soper was tried only for the murder of his wife. Now, this was likely strategic for any number of reasons, not the least of which, if the jury did not convict him of that crime, the prosecution could then try him for either of his 2 children's murders. Soper's mother, 1 brother, and 1 sister were among those in the court to support him. His brother Archie, the Kansas City druggist who said he would fear him as he would a wild beast, did not come. Newspapers had rightly predicted that Soper would present an insanity defense. He made a statement that on the night he was born, his father attempted to kill his mother, and therefore he was a child of crime. For about 2 hours on the opening day of testimony, his court-appointed attorneys put his mother, his sister, and a Cass County deputy on the stand to present testimony that he was insane and that insanity ran in his family. They testified that Soper's grandmother had been insane, as well as 2 of his father's cousins. 3 doctors were called to testify that Soper was predisposed to insanity. They testified that he suffers from paranoia complicated by religious delusions. Other doctors testified that he was as sane as anyone. The defense also attempted to highlight Soper's relationship with his family before the murders, saying that he had been nothing but loving and kind. They cited this as further proof that he had to have been temporarily insane when he brutally murdered them. Prosecutors sought to prove that Soper was always bad, citing his stint in the penitentiary and his preparations to leave Archie in the days prior to the murder. Soper is said to have broken down and wept bitterly when the prosecutor read the letter Soper left on the nightstand next to his dead wife and son, confessing to the killings. During testimony, additional details of the night of the killing were brought to light. It was said that Soper killed his wife and children after they had gone to sleep around 11 o'clock on the night of Tuesday, April 21st, 1891. After the murders, he washed his hands in a pan of water in the kitchen, which he left sitting on the stove where he had heated it. Then he returned to the bedroom where his wife and son lay dead and wrote by the lamplight the 2 letters that were later found on the nightstand. After writing the letters, he said he read from the Bible until 5 a.m., when he locked up the house and went to board the train to Kansas City. He told the Justice of the Peace Hodges that he didn't kill that devil in Clay County, as he had referenced in his letters, because he didn't think he had time. He was in Kansas City only about half an hour between departing one train and boarding the next, which took him west. Further rumblings were reported around the time of the trial of Soper's actions and mindset in the days leading up to the murder. One report that surfaced was that he was angry that an illegal bar, then referred to as a blind tiger, was operating in Archie, and he couldn't bear to live in a town where such a thing was taking place. Another rumor was that he had argued with his wife about her joining the Christian church. On the morning of December 4th, and after 16 hours of deliberation, the jury found Soper guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. He and his mother cried and sobbed at the reading of the verdict. His execution was scheduled for February 4th, 1898, but was postponed while his case was appealed to the state Supreme Court. Soper spent all of 1898 in the Cass County Jail. Occasionally, brief mentions of his time there indicated that his only correspondent was his mother. His brothers, sister, and wife in Oregon would have nothing to do with him. During at least part of that time, he was the only prisoner in the jail. He was periodically on suicide watch. At least once, he reportedly refused a visit by ministers seeking to console him. He said after people thought he was crazy over religion at the time of the murders, he was now done with it. By October, when the Supreme Court would take up his appeal, he was described as indifferent toward the outcome, having no interest in anything. His attorneys made several arguments to the Supreme Court, perhaps most notably challenging that the letters he left behind at the murder scene could not be shown to have been written by him without proof of his handwriting. The court responded that these letters, which were, quote, get what they said here, confessing the perpetration of the murder of the defendant's wife and children, found on a stand in the house near the bodies after the homicide and dated on the day of the homicide, written on the defendant's letterheads and signed with his name and spattered with blood, and where defendant immediately fled from the state, are admissible without proof of defendant's handwriting. The court also rejected the argument that a person could be sane immediately before and immediately after the commission of a crime, but could be insane while committing the crime. It upheld Soper's conviction and his death sentence. In the days leading up to his hanging, there was an effort launched to have his sentence commuted. I wasn't able to find an article elaborating on the reasoning behind the effort, but the response was great. It was denounced by hundreds who attended a meeting in Archie in which resolutions were adopted to that effect. There was talk of hanging in effigy the former sheriff J.H. Holton, who was one of those seeking clemency, but that idea was rejected. Resolutions were presented to Governor Stevens in person. They said those who sought clemency for Soper were, quote, worshippers of murderers as citizens unworthy of recognition, who by their desire to attract cheap and vulgar notoriety, who have ever overstepped the bounds of justice and reason, and cultivating a spirit within the people which will ultimately cause them disregard of the laws and bring about the use of mob violence when it could be avoided. Governor Stevens, predictably, declined to act to stop the execution. Soper said he was disappointed by this action. His actions in his final hours were described as bravado. The day before the execution, he was allowed to go to the gallows, which were set up in the basement of the Cass County Courthouse, to go up on the scaffold and to test it. He tried the trap and even offered suggestions to Sheriff F.M. Woolridge. He told a reporter, quote, I can hardly wait for the time of the execution to come. The suspense and waiting are worse than the execution can possibly be. The following night, he slept only 2 hours. He continued rejecting the efforts of ministers seeking to console him. On the morning of March 30th, 1899, Soper was up by 4:30 when he picked at his breakfast. At 5:23, he ascended the stairs with Sheriff Woolridge, who then personally tied Soper's hands and feet and adjusted the black cap that would cover the condemned man's face. At 5:27, Woolridge told him, Goodbye, Mr. Soper. May God have mercy on you. And he threw the lever. Soper fell 7 feet and his neck was broken. He was pronounced dead 10 minutes later. His body was taken by one of his brothers and buried in a Kearney cemetery. 8 years after a crime that had shocked Missouri, a man who had killed his wife and 3 of his own children and eluded authorities for 6 years was gone just like that, anticlimactically. But Soper's story wasn't finished. Remember his letters, the ones we discussed earlier, for what they revealed about the man? He wrote another one. 2 days before he died, Soper penned this from his jail cell, quote, Perhaps a few words from me at this time may be appreciated by all good people, as if he's got a fan base waiting to hear from him. Quote, I feel like I have been unjustly persecuted. I know that the circumstances surrounding my birth and the influences under which I have labored have not been rightly understood. And I humbly trust that all right-minded people will give careful and due consideration to what I say. About the time of my conception and during the period of my gestation, my mother was laboring under the conviction of sin. Long years ago, she told me about her religious experience, that she firmly believed at the time if she died in that condition, she would be forever lost. Day after day, she thought about it, and many a night she would get up and walk the floor, troubled with doubts and fears and anxiety, and suffer tortures of mind which only a sin-burdened soul can suffer. Under such conditions, I was conceived and brought into the world. With such an equipment, would any of you like to undertake the journey of life? Would you? Remember, friends, I do not blame my mother. Far from it. I feel for her only the holiest, tenderest, and most sacred love. I have tried, oh so hard, to live right, and yet failed. Why it has been my lot, I don't know, but I will know in a short time. Now, reader, go back to the time of my birth. Read again, and you will see that my mother's thoughts were indelibly impressed upon my mind. They were burned into my brain. There the fire smoldered, and when long years afterward I passed through the same experiences, the spark was ignited and the explosion came. I was lost and bewildered. In the hour of distress, I committed the overt act for which I am here today. In that hour, reason had deserted her throne, and willpower was lost in mental darkness. When returning consciousness came back, I got up and staggered out into the world. I tried to mend the broken threads of life, but failed. Why have I been tortured? Why have I been driven to destruction? I know not, but God is just and merciful, and with a penitent prayer I commit my soul to his keeping. To the people of Harrisonville and Cass County, I want to say that during my confinement here, Mr. Woolridge has treated me with the kindest consideration. For him and all his family, I entertain the highest regards. I have only words of praise for them. I shall always regret that our friendship has been so short. To my attorneys, who so ably and faithfully worked for me, I feel profoundly grateful. To all others who worked on my behalf, I beg to be remembered kindly. I remember all your kind words and assurances of sympathy. To those who have worked against me, I want to say, while you have erred and done wrong, while you allowed your mind to become prejudiced with a wrong motive, yet I forgive you all. I cherish no ill will. I harbor no bad thoughts. I shall say no unkind words. I sincerely pity you. And now, as I am about to leave this world, I pray to God to have mercy and forgive you, that it may lead you to know the truth and help you to be more merciful to your fellow beings. Farewell, E.B. Soper. Once more, Soper's letters are about him. But what else do they reveal? Now, as I mentioned earlier, to answer that question, I was fortunate enough to speak with Director of the Missouri Department of Mental Health, Dr. Angeline Stanislaus. In her career of more than 20 years, she has interviewed numerous convicted persons, including many people sentenced to death in Missouri and Illinois. My first question to her is one that so many reporters and Soper's own brother Archibald had struggled with throughout this story. Was Edward Bates Soper insane? Dr. Stanislaus believes he was not. Quote, "This man definitely did not appear to be out of touch with reality. He did not seem to be influenced by what we would call a psychotic mental state. And the reason I say that is because if you look at the crime scene as laid out, there was a lot of planning. The level of planning was very systematic," the doctor told me. She said what gripped her more than anything about Soper's story was what played out after the killings at his home in Archie. He stayed in the house, not only washed his hands, but took the time to heat the water on the stove first. He sat by the lamplight, penning his letters to the justice of the peace and to the public, and, so he says, read the Bible. And all of this after brutally murdering his wife and 2 children, and with their lifeless bodies right next to him. Quote, "Typically, if people do a crime, they panic. But Mr. Soper did not show any evidence of a state of panic. We're looking at a good 3 or 4 hours or longer over the night, but he was still able to have this clarity in putting all what needed to be done and writing it and organizing everything before he left." Dr. Stanislaus said the most striking thing about Soper's letters is his desire for attention. From asking that one be printed in the Kansas City Times after the murders in Archie, to writing another before he is hung, as if adoring fans want to know what he has to say. He was seemingly ahead of his time in knowing that the public would be fascinated by serial killers such as himself. From the opening line of his final letter, "Perhaps a few words from me at this time may be appreciated by all good people," he's playing to an audience. The doctor said the need for publicity, the need that his thoughts are read by a bigger audience, he wants to be that fascination for a lot of people. He truly believes that people want to hear from him, which most people would have thought, if they truly have a sense of guilt, they would actually feel, why would anybody want to hear from somebody who has repeatedly murdered? But his reality is that people are really fascinated by what he has done, and it's true. Most notably, perhaps, is that Soper's letters are again all about him. He expresses no remorse, no sadness about having murdered his family members, and attempts to portray himself as persecuted and a victim. He even goes so far as to thank those who have been kind to him and to forgive those who he feels were his oppressors, as if wanting to appear a just, magnanimous individual. At the same time, he's trying to give the sense that he has a mental defect, but Dr. Stanislaus says he doesn't know the right words to use. Quote, "There is no coherent phrasing of this, and this you see so many times when an individual's trying to do an insanity defense or something after a crime, and they want to bring a mental state element into it, but just doesn't follow all the flow together, and this is one of those cases." Dr. Stanislaus said Soper reminds her of at least one of the condemned men she's interviewed in recent years, if only in a shared need for publicity. But Soper said one thing in his letters she said she's never encountered before. There is one thing in his letters she's never encountered before. Quote, "He doesn't blame his wife or the children, but his explanation for killing them was to be merciful to them, which is something I have not heard in my career." Remember, she's been doing this 20 years. She said she'd never heard that. "I have only often heard it as, I was angry, I was upset with them. This was not driven by anger. There doesn't seem to have been an acute explosion of emotions here, but I killed them just to be merciful. That particular sentence really stood out to me," said Dr. Stanislaus. She said it's also possible he didn't actually read the Bible after the murders in Archie, but used this and other mentions of religion in his effort to convince the public that he was a good but troubled man. Even she could not guess as to a motive for any of the murders Soper committed. She said the only person who could answer that question was him, and she said she would love to have been able to have interviewed him. Now, again, you can hear my interview with her if you look for the podcast in the other episodes, and I'll plug where that is again at the end of this broadcast. But wait, there's more. Soper had one more surprise. At the beginning of this episode, we talked about the murder of Soper's father, John, in 1880. Because we did that, you can probably guess what I'm about to say to you. That's right, he also killed his father. Now, according to an article that was carried by papers including the Sedalia Democrat, Soper told Sheriff Woolridge he had committed the crime, but the confession was not made public until after the execution. He said that at around the age of 6 or 7, he developed a grudge against his father that only grew stronger as he got older. He eventually decided to kill him and thought for some time about how he could commit the murder without being caught. He said he knew that his father fed his cattle each evening and decided that would be the best time. On the night of the murder, he finished his work early and said he would go to the Literary Society meeting in town. Instead of going into town, he stopped in the woods at the edge of the family property. When his father came out, he went to the feedlot. John asked Edward why he had not gone to the Literary Society, to which Edward said he couldn't get across the creek. When John turned his back, Edward shot him. Edward ran to the creek, where he said he threw the gun into a deep hole and then ran to the schoolhouse where the meeting of the Literary Society was taking place, arriving a little late, but not enough to arouse suspicion. Think then, too, about Thomas Mabe and his family. He was the man who sat in jail for a year, facing the possibility that he would be charged and even hung for the murder of John Soper. Imagine what psychological torture this would have been for Mabe and his loved ones. Edward stood by and said nothing for that entire year, knowing that another man might die for his crime, and then said nothing for another 18 years. So Edward Bates Soper murdered 5 members of his own family, and you, my astute listener, figured out that last one probably before I even told you. Now, did you catch the other one? Do you remember Samuel, Soper's brother, who I said was considered one of the preeminent educators of the state. You might remember me saying he died of what was supposed to be malaria. Well, he died in January, an unusual time to catch malaria, at least in Missouri. His death was also closely followed by a visit from, you guessed it, Edward. You might also remember that it was around this time Edward was running a drugstore. According to some accounts, he had brought to Samuel a special prescription. Soper never addressed the murder of his brother, but it is thought by those who knew his story that he might have murdered Samuel as well. One wonders whether, while working as a druggist, Soper gave anyone else a special prescription. And that, my friends, is the case of Edward Bates Soper. Again, I want to thank you for listening to tonight's broadcast, and thank you for listening to the show. I'll give you a few plugs of where to find the rest of the show here in just a moment. And before I get to that, again, I want to thank Daryl Limpus, Deb Bova, a staffer at the City of Archie, Dr. Stanislaus, as well as the Director of the Department of Mental Health, Mark Stringer, and Ronette Schulte, Dr. Stanislaus's legislative assistant, and Legislative Affairs Director Deborah Walker, who also helped me set that up. And again, I want to thank Professor Rodney Uphoff, who told me that Soper's case that went before the Supreme Court really didn't set any precedent. It wasn't around for many years as being cited by other cases. That was the main question I went to him with, but that was another fascinating conversation I was able to have as a result of this. I do have one question in chat. If you've got any other questions, I'll stick around here for a couple of minutes. If anyone else wants to ask me some questions about this case or anything else to do with the show. By the way, you might have noticed the posters behind me, which I'm proud of, and I hope you get a kick out of the Charlie Brown Christmas tree over here. I put that up tonight just for you all for this broadcast. Amy is asking, does the doctor know why Soper would choose to murder his family versus strangers, and people weaker than him versus strangers? That is part of the discussion we had, and I'm trying to remember now if that was something she and I talked about during the recorded interview, which, again, you can hear if you find the podcast, or if that's something that we just talked about off the air, if you will, off mic. But we did talk about that, and I don't remember that she had a good answer for that question. It was another one of those things that she felt like she would almost have to ask him in person. But again, that's me going off of my memory, and I did that interview 7 or 8 months ago. I might recommend, Amy, if you don't mind, find that interview. It's one of the bonus episodes on the podcast, and listen to that interview. And I kind of want to say that I asked her that question, but I don't remember that it was one that she was able to answer. It's certainly something that I've wondered. As I said there at the end of the episode, wondering whether when he was a druggist, if he did poison his brother, did he poison anyone else? But it's notable to me that certainly in all the research that I've done, there is no suspicion, there's no theory, there's no mention of him being tied to any other murders. It was only the members of his family. And with his reputation, with other crimes that might have gone unsolved around the same time frame, I would say someone would have at least speculated if they thought there was a connection, just because, well, we know this guy over here killed all these people. What about these other cases that happened around the same time? I don't see any speculation that he was connected to any murders outside of his own family. And I wondered the same thing that you just asked. Mindy, thank you for joining me late. And I do hope that you get to watch this whole thing from the beginning. And please share it with your friends, tell your friends, your family to join in as well. If anybody else has any questions, feel free to type those in. I didn't have as many viewers tonight as we did the last time, but that's all right. I plan to keep doing these. I think people enjoy them, and I'm still busily working on season 2. I'm looking forward to bringing you some of those cases, which I find compelling. The one I'm working on now is frankly a very sad and sobering case because of what the woman involved went throughout her life. But I'm anxious to wrap that up and bring that to you. At my current pace of working, I'm almost done with what would be the second episode of season 2. If I do things the way I've been doing them, I'll release the whole season at once. So it'll probably be sometime around June or July before I get some more episodes ready to go, and I'm ready to do that. But I hope you'll watch for season 2 as well. And Amy and everybody else, I mentioned that I would plug where you can find the podcast. And again, please Tell your friends, tell your family. Please tell others who might like true crime. I really think that a lot of people who are fans of true crime are going to hear cases on this podcast that they might not have heard anywhere else. Now, they've probably heard the Greenlease case. They've probably heard a couple of the ones that I've done. But Soper is one that I certainly had never heard of before I stumbled across it. I think the tavern fire will be new to a lot of people. So please share this with other people, especially if you know that they like history and or true crime. So you can find, again, the podcast on Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Google Podcasts. And please, again, find me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Like the pages, give me some feedback. Please subscribe, by the way, to the podcast. Like I say, the more I can build up these numbers, the number of downloads, the number of subscribers, the number of views on YouTube, the more I'm going to be able to do this. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of time into each of these cases. I love doing it. But like I say, after 2 or 3 seasons of this, if I'm not seeing a lot of response, and certainly if I'm not making a little bit of money off of it too, I may have to reconsider doing it. I don't like to be that way, but it's just for the amount of time I'm putting into it, that's just the way it is. And I hope you understand that. But please do share it with your friends and your family. And again, I broke 1,000 listeners just in the last few days. That's since September 2nd. I feel good about that. I do. I don't know if, maybe some other podcasts grew more over that same period of time, but I'm excited about those numbers. And I thank all of you. Thank you, Mindy, for that compliment. I appreciate it. Physical locations of murders. So does Soper's house still stand? I'm disappointed to say I don't believe that it does. Now, I haven't been to Archie to look for it, but I've talked to 3 different people about this. 2 of them, Deb Bova and Daryl Olympus, who helped me get some of the information for this case. But I've talked to a couple of people in Archie, and they tell me that where his house has been torn down years ago. I haven't been to Archie yet to see what was in that spot. But that's my plan, is to go visit Archie probably maybe in the next month or 2, as I've got a little bit of time to kill before one of my other jobs picks up. But my understanding is that his house has been torn down. The cemetery he was buried in, now I didn't mention in the script because I don't know, I think most people are probably less concerned about going to visit maybe the grave of the killer than they are the victim, although some people like myself would be fascinated to visit both. His grave is in a family cemetery, and I forget the name of it. I don't have it in front of me here, but it's part of it is Bates Cemetery up in the Kearney area. And again, I was very disappointed to find out that the cemetery where his wife and 2 children were buried apparently was bulldozed, and at least part of it seems to be under a drainage lagoon just off the South Grand River there on the outskirts of Archie. I plan to go back to that site. I want to visit it again. To me, it was important to visit that site. I write about some of these people, and it means something to me. I've got little kids. I mean, I had a 6-year-old daughter at the time I was writing this. And to imagine somebody doing that to a 6-year-old girl. So it was important to me to go visit that site. And that's the same reason I went and visited the graves of the Meeks family. If you watched the last broadcast, we talked about the Meeks family murders. I went and visited their graves. So no, his house does not still stand. And I almost wonder if there isn't somebody in that town who doesn't know what they've got, who maybe has photos of the hanging, who maybe has old photos of the town, that maybe the house is depicted. You never know what somebody's got in their attic or their basement somewhere, and they just don't know what it is. But it would be amazing to me to see some of those things turn up. So again, for those of you who did stick around, thank you. If anybody's got any last minute questions or anything, but again, you can find the podcast Show Me Murder on Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Google Play. Working on a couple more, and I'm excitedly working on season 2. I cannot wait to bring it to you. Thank you all for 1,000 listens in September, October, November, 4 months. Thank you for that. 3 months, I guess 3 months for 1,000 listens in 3 months. And I look forward to lots and lots more listens. And please feel free to hop on the Facebook page, like it if you haven't already, and leave me some reviews if you like the show. I hope to use those reviews to help promote the show going forward. I think that's going to wrap it up for tonight. Thank you all for turning out again and participating. And I hope to see some more views of this after I post it to YouTube. It will be available, and I'll post it too on the Facebook page and put it out through Twitter as well. Thank you, Amy. Thank you and Mindy both, and for participating and just talking to me tonight. It's good to connect with people, even if it's over such dark material. All right, I'm going to wrap this up for the night, but I do plan to do another one of these maybe in a couple of months. And I wish you all happy holidays, and thanks for watching.